So our second speaker is Sarah Wheadon. Sarah is a partner with Paris Smith and heads up the regulatory team. She acts for individuals, businesses, charities, local authorities and other organisations. She has higher audience rights and prosecutes for the RSPCA and other organisations in enforcing breaches of legislation before the criminal courts. Sarah spends much of her time not actually in court, but working with organisations to manage risk posed by regulation and the consequences of non-compliance, and looking at putting policies and procedures in place so that organisations are best placed to minimise their risk. Today, Sarah is going to talk about fraud and related issues in the charity sector. Sarah.
Heard from Steve about how you can secure more funds for your charity. My 20 minutes will be spent talking to you about how you can make sure that that money stays in your charity and isn't lost through fraud. You may have expected an accountant in my place this morning. I come at it from a slightly different angle, as you've heard from Nick, based on my experience of advising clients about how to protect and enhance their organisation's value and reputation through effective risk management. And it's the risk management angle that I'll be concentrating on this morning. These are just two headlines I found. Royal Horticultural Society is also embroiled in some negative headlines. Their former head of operations has been charged with fraud, allegedly involving £700,000 over a 10-year period. And just last week, some of you may have read about a former finance officer at Pembroke College in Cambridge who was sent to prison for 2.5 years for falsifying invoices to obtain over £285,000 between June 2012 and January 2014. And this was to fund a gambling addiction. Apparently, the 41-year-old mum of two was in charge of paying the college suppliers via BACS on a weekly basis, and she started by duplicating one payment a week, and that increased to up to 4 times a week. And this was spotted by an internal audit carried out by the college. So what sorts of things do you think your donors will feel when you hear about stories like this? How could anyone do that to a charity, maybe? She must have been desperate. How did the charity not notice? How, as a donor, can I be reassured that my donation, the money that I've earned, is going to where I thought it was going? These are not the sort of headlines or media interest that any charity or the charity sector wants. And what about the cost? Well, you might well ask. There are wide-ranging figures from different sources, which only leaves me, as a humble lawyer, to conclude that no one really knows. In June 2013, the National Fraud Authority put the estimated cost to registered charities across the UK for the year up to March 2012 at £147.3 million. Now, it has to be said, at that time, some commentators thought that that was a low figure, and this is probably borne out by the next figure that I'm going to give you. In January last year, a report prepared by Accountants BDO and the Centre for Counter-Fraud Studies of the University of Portsmouth estimated the loss to 842 UK registered charities with expenditure of over £10 million a year at £1.65 billion a year. Quite a difference. So, as they say, now for the legal bit. I can actually get this to work. The Fraud Act 2006, there is one general offence of fraud, 3 ways of committing it. So I'm just going to concentrate on these today. So false representation, this might include, for example, misusing a credit card to pay for items, or sending a phishing email in order to obtain confidential financial information. Abuse of position, this is where a person in a privileged position who is expected to safeguard or not act against another's financial interest does in fact do exactly that. And so this will apply to the employer-employee relationship, charity and volunteer relationship. And it's one of the offences with which the Cambridge finance officer was found guilty. All have common elements: dishonesty and the intention to make something either for themselves or for another, or to cause another loss or expose someone else to the risk of loss. And importantly, it's not necessary for the gain or loss to actually have taken place. So, types of fraud. Generally, they're categorised as internal or external. So internal fraud could be an employee or volunteer diverting donations to their own bank account, using charity database for commercial gain, creating false invoices or expenses claims, or misusing the charity credit card. An external could be obtaining grant funding on false pretences, identity fraud, unauthorised fundraising, or again sending the phishing emails. So you think, well, that's all very nice. It'll never happen to us. We're not a big charity. That might be what you're thinking. You might be thinking, we've never had a problem, so we must be doing something right. That might well be because you are doing something right, which is great. It may well be because you've been lucky. I was speaking with a friend of mine recently, a trustee of a small charity, and they hadn't really realised or haven't given it any thought that their banking went online. And they hadn't realised or thought about the fact that their treasurer was the person who had sole access to their account. Now, some would say they might be lucky, but it happens. So what does your regulator think? And I've taken this from the Charity Commission Compliance Toolkit and somewhat shoehorned it, but essentially they say no charity can regard itself as being immune to the risk of financial crime. And it must be right that even a small charity is not immune from the risk. A fraudster may well perceive that a smaller charity has less sophisticated anti-fraud measures, an easy touch, and a lower level fraud could be perpetrated over a much longer period without detection. So, on the basis that no one here is immune from the risk of fraud, how are you going to protect your charity? The formula that I'm putting up on the slide is the same formula for all risk management, whether within a charity, within a business. And fraud, after all, is a business risk. Now, it's not realistic for me to stand here and say that you can eliminate all risk of fraud, but the outcome your charity will want to achieve is to reduce the risk to the lowest level possible. So the starting point, number one on the list, is your trustees. And they no doubt will understand their duty to safeguard the funds and assets of the charity and ensure the charitable objectives are achieved. And it's them that need to instill the culture in the charity. And strong leadership coupled with good financial and other controls is the best best combination to protect the charity. Assessing the risk, which is the next on the list, is the cornerstone to understanding what you as a charity need to do to protect it from the risk of fraud. And first of all, you need to look at the type of risk that your charity may face. Does it arise from your activities, where you operate, country where you operate, your banking procedures, or the way in which you fundraise? You then need to assess the likelihood of the risk happening, and finally the potential impact on the charity should it happen. And there will be different risks for different charities depending on your size and setup, but assessing those risks will enable you to prioritise. And don't ignore those risks which are or may be least likely to happen. In that group may be something which has the potential to have a catastrophic impact on your charity, which will elevate it from the bottom of the pile straight up to near the top. Risk assessment is a dynamic process. It's important to review them regularly as the charity circumstances or types of fraud out there are evolving or developing. You may change the way you fundraise. You've heard about Steve going online. That may well involve some additional risks that you need to think about. And out of the risk assessment will come financial and other controls and the procedures that you need to put in place. So they may cover vetting procedures, especially for staff or others who are responsible for finances, segregation of duties, rotation of duties to ensure that not one person is doing all of that, is not responsible for all the finances, reconciliation of financial records, banking procedures, fraud detection and monitoring processes such as spot checks, and maintaining a list of the charity's assets. You also might want to think about due diligence checks on the identity and legitimacy of the organisations you are working with. And depending on your size, you may want some of those in writing, but again, you just need to use your judgment as to what's the best thing for your charity. You may want a formal anti-fraud policy to set out what you want to achieve, your strategy, and to clarify who's responsible for what. And you may also want a response plan in case something goes wrong, and I'm going to talk about that a little later on. Policies and procedures, and I'm a big advocate of this, need to be proportionate to the risk. No one would expect a small charity to have absolutely awash with policies and procedures, but the more complex things become, the more the need for policies and procedures. So you just need to look at that, what's reasonable and proportionate for our charity. They also need to work and dovetail with other policies, your data protection, your HR policies on whistleblowing and disciplinary procedures. Again, there's no point having standalone policies. They won't work unless they dovetail with the others that you have. Communication and training. Now, in my experience, this is often the missing link. I tend to find that organisations either don't have any policies and procedures at all, or they have the fantastic policies sat there gathering dust. Nobody knows about them. If you've got procedures, tell your staff about them in whatever way is the best way to ensure they understand what is required of them. You heard Steve talk about communication. Effective communication is people understanding what you're saying, not just giving them information and expecting them to understand. Measure your performance. Again, something that Steve talked about. And audit and review. Test and review your policies and risk assessments regularly. This is not a tick box exercise. Great, we've done that, put it in the drawer for the next 5 years. You need to keep on looking back and reviewing what you're doing. So if you suspect or find fraud, act promptly and also sensitively. Activate a response plan, which is something I mentioned earlier on. In the immediate aftermath of finding out or thinking something's gone wrong, that feeling in the pit of the stomach, this isn't good. Really, really good to have a clear path to follow. And I'm an advocate of it for bigger or smaller charities. And it's really something to have in place for any sort of risk that you think if something goes wrong, it could really cause major problems either reputationally or financially. It might only just be an A4 sheet of paper, but have on there what you're going to do and when, who you're going to contact, details for action fraud, your insurer, a forensic accountant, friendly lawyers, and it will save you scrabbling around in what will no doubt be a very stressful time. Bear in mind, this isn't a plug for lawyers, but I'm going to say it anyway, but if you engage a solicitor for any advice, any communication with them has that cloak of confidentiality and will be protected from disclosure in any subsequent regulatory or police investigation. Strategically, you might want to engage your solicitor from an early stage in order to get that protection. Again, in my experience, I tend to get involved or be asked to get involved too far down the line. Much better, at least just pick up the phone and see whether you need that help at that stage. Lawyer can always say, no, that's fine, you carry on and we'll talk later on. Just pick up the phone earlier. You may also need to make a serious incident report if there is actual or suspected serious incident of fraud or another significant risk, for instance, to the charity's reputation. There is no minimum figure on what triggers a serious incident report, and this is a judgment call, one of those fantastic judgment calls for the trustees given the circumstances. The overarching thought, though, is the trustees must be able to demonstrate that they've acted in the best interest of the charity and taken reasonable and proportionate steps. And for this reason, it's recommended by the Charity Commission, and I agree with this and endorse it, of the trustees keeping records of any decision regarding actual suspected fraud. This will enable you to demonstrate the rationale behind any decision that you've taken. You need to review the security to ensure no further losses to the charity. If a member of staff is involved, you may want to make sure that they haven't got access to the offices or to computers. Another really important thing is to have a communication strategy, one person who will deal with the media, any inquiries, because you don't want people giving different messages from the charity. You may want to take legal advice on what you can or cannot say to avoid prejudicing ongoing investigations. Internal investigations, you may well need to engage a forensic accountant. So again, you need to have the name of that person that you would call if you needed to call on them. Do you need help or advice to ensure evidence is preserved? This actually may well go up the list of things that you need to do to make sure that that is taken care of. If you can't recover your losses through insurance, think about other ways that you might be able to do so, but do take legal advice. Litigation is a minefield. And again, the process of reviewing your policies, can controls be tighter? What can we do to ensure that this doesn't happen again, or this near miss that we've had doesn't happen, doesn't turn into a real problem? And the benefits of getting it right. Smiley face. I've just listed here, this actual slide started off as the implications of getting it wrong. And I thought, well, that's a bit negative to finish off, so I actually turned it all the way around. And I actually want to focus on the positives of good financial risk management to see the financial and reputational benefits that are worth the investment. And I think sort of take-home message is there are real tangible benefits to getting risk management right, and not least the last one on that slide, peace of mind. Thank you.